I bet you're excited to be back. Here we are for part 2. Now, the first video was about 56 minutes. So, knowing that our lectures are usually an hour and 20 minutes, that means I have 25 minutes left. So, to respect your time and to respect, what our schedule says the lectures will be, I will just get through as much as we can in those 25 minutes. And that means that what you're watching is the equivalent of an hour and 20-minute lecture in person. All right, so in the first video on articulations, we spent a lot of time talking about different types of joints, what they're made up of, what constitutes stability for different types of joints versus mobility. And then we ended off by talking about the open and closed pack positions for joints. So in this second part, what I really want to get through is I want to talk about range of motion flexibility, and then I really want to get through lever systems. So if I can do that, I will be a happy cookie. Okay, so you can see in your notes here, now we are at Roman numeral 4, range of motion. So I want to make sure I get down some definitions for you. So if we look at range of motion, and we're going to be doing this in lab, our next lab, range of motion is defined as the motion around a joint. We usually measure range of motion using a goniometer. So it looks like this knee is flexed to about 90 degrees, right? If I were to draw this line, it's about 90 degrees. Well, that's 90 degrees of knee flexion. 90 degrees of a certain motion around the knee. Okay. When we measure range of motion, you might see such things as active range of motion versus passive range of motion. I'm not too worried about these, but I'm just putting it out there. Active means the person themselves moves the joint. Passive means if a therapist or someone else gives a little push. So usually the passive range of motion is a little bit more than active range of motion, but we're not going to worry about those. I just wanted to throw it out there. You can see there, letter B, factors affecting range of motion. Well, muscle flexibility, muscle size, the laxity of ligaments or joint capsules, okay, fine. But what I want to do is I want to define flexibility. So we talked about range of motion. Let's now talk about flexibility because they're not necessarily the same thing. Flexibility, I think a simple definition of flexibility is the ability of muscles. So now we're not really talking about the ability of motion around joints, the joint surfaces. Now we're talking about muscles, the ability of muscles to move around a joint. Range of motion has more to do with the joint surfaces. Of course, other things can get in the way, but this has more to do with the joint itself versus flexibility, which has to do with the muscles around the joint. So you can read, just make sure that you know those definitions. I just have to make sure that I know what our timeline is. So 4:50, I can go until 10 after. Okay, I want to make sure I respect your time. I'm just going to talk about a couple things really quickly. Under flexibility there, it says on your notes, relationship to injury. A lot of people, it's common knowledge to think poor flexibility equals higher risk of injury. And that isn't always the case. Certainly, we would like, probably we can draw some correlation. So there's some correlation between flexibility changes or ability to be flexible and injury risk. But it's not as causative as you might think. So while stretching is important for flexibility, it doesn't seem to have the exact causative or high correlation to injuries that we think. Okay. Number 2 there, can you improve flexibility? Of course you can, but only within a certain range is how I would say. So the best way that I think to think about this is based on your DNA, you have a certain range of available flexibility. So if you do a lot of stretching and are more body conscious, you might be on the higher end of the ability for flexibility of that muscle. You know, if you're a dancer and you grow up over and over again, stretching, well, of course you're going to be on the higher end. Versus if you don't work on it, you'll be on the lower end. But there is a genetic component. So within the genetics that you have, you certainly are able to improve your flexibility to a certain extent. We are going to, before I do that, here are some average range of motion in degrees for joints and motions. You don't need to know these now, right? Don't need to know them. You'll see as we go on through the semester, a lot of times I just use shorthand. So S apostrophe just means shoulder. So a capital letter followed by an apostrophe is a joint. Shoulder, elbow, wrist, hip, knee, ankle. You don't need to know these. I just wanted to have this on file for you. You can even do cervical, thoracic, and lumbar spine. Okay. In lab, we're going to be looking at different types of stretching techniques to see which might be the most beneficial for certain situations. So you'll review this in lab, but for now, just be able to give a basic definition. A static stretch is just where you stretch and hold. The more traditional, stretch and hold. Dynamic means you're stretching while moving. Dynamic stretching has become much more popular. So you can do like some easy walking lunges, some walking leg kicks, things like that. Those are more of a dynamic stretching while moving. Old school, ballistic. Ballistic stretching is an old school where you're more or less bouncing up and down. So you stretch, for your hamstrings, you would stretch down, touch your toes, come up, stretch down again. This is a little bit more old school. We don't use it as often. And then in lab, we are going to do something called proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation. And this is when you alternate between stretching and muscle contraction. It'll be much easier for me to show you in person. Maybe you've had this done to you or done it to someone else already. It can be very effective if done safely. But for now, let's just get the basic definition down. So it's a type of stretching where you alternate between stretching and contraction, muscle contraction. So you stretch that muscle, then you contract it, then you stretch it again. Okay, I want to talk about lever systems. And I've got 15 minutes to do it. How very exciting. When we talk about joints, the joints of our body, particularly the limbs, the synovial joints of our limbs, that is an axis of rotation of which we are moving body segments. And our bones are arranged in such a way that we can utilize our muscles to move those segments around the joint or axis. And in doing so, we are creating lever systems. Now, I don't want you to freak out. I am here to make it as easy as possible. So let me walk you through what I think is a reasonably understandable way to go through this. So you should first be able to define a lever system. A lever system is a tool or setup that is designed to make something easier. In other words, it's designed to give a mechanical advantage. A great example of a lever system in everyday life is a wheelbarrow. If you have something heavy to lift or a lot of things to move, we utilize a wheelbarrow. It's a lever arm with one wheel at the end. By using that, it allows us to move much more weight or many more things more easily. So first, be able to define a lever system, some kind of tool or some kind of arrangement or setup that is designed to make things easier. Our muscles and bones are arranged in lever systems. It's all about gaining a mechanical advantage. The mechanical advantage is just a fancy way of saying making things easier. It is possible to calculate the mechanical advantage. We are not going to necessarily have you do that in a crazy way. I just want to point out that it's possible to measure, right? Anytime when you do this equation, any time that the mechanical advantage is greater than 1, you're producing more force than the effort going into it. This would be like a wheelbarrow. You're able to move more weight using the wheelbarrow than you can with just your arms alone. So basically, if it's over 1, you're gaining a mechanical advantage, right? For a wheelbarrow, you're able to move more weight than you would without the wheelbarrow. So the higher the mechanical advantage, the higher this number, the better the mechanical advantage. So the higher the number, the better the mechanical advantage. Now, technically, when we talk about muscle-bone lever systems, most often, almost always in fact, the mechanical advantage is less than 1. And you might think, well, what's the point? Well, sometimes it's not all just about gross force. So sometimes, even if it's less than 1, the tool or the arrangement can give you a benefit of more control, also more speed, larger range of motion. So the possible benefits of a lever system would be generate more force, improve control, improve speed, larger range of motion. If you have a mechanical advantage over 1, you're really going to have the benefit of better force. But that doesn't mean that we still can't benefit from a mechanical advantage if it's lower than 1. So even our muscles and bones, which if we do the calculation, usually have a mechanical advantage less than 1, it still gives us a benefit. Control, speed, better range of motion. So for now, be able to define it. You don't need to know the exact formula. Know that you can calculate it. If it's over 1, you can produce more force. It's like a mechanical advantage in force or weight carrying. But even if it's lower than 1, we can still have other benefits, such as the benefits we see in our body. Okay, so I'm going to move pretty quickly, but you have the ability to replay this, pause, take more notes, replay it. So there's 3 classes of lever systems, and I'm going to make this easier for you. The way that I would remember the first, second, and third class lever system. In a first class lever, I would think of a real life example. A real life example is a seesaw. It is also scissors, but I think a seesaw is better. Some people call it a teeter-totter. You have one person on one end at the playground and another person on the other end at the playground. The key about a seesaw, if you just think about a seesaw or teeter-totter, don't you remember that the fulcrum is in the middle? The fulcrum or the axis is in the middle. And then be able to give an example in the body. An example of a synovial joint that is arranged as a first-class lever system is the atlanto-occipital joint. This is the joint between the atlas, which is the first vertebra, C1, and the occipital bone. This is where your occiput, or your skull, rests on your spinal cord, your vertebral column. This joint gives you the ability to put your head down and put it back, forward and back, flex and extend, much like a seesaw can move up or down. I really think it's easiest to think of a real-life example. A real-life example of a second-class lever is a wheelbarrow. When I picture a wheelbarrow, I know that the load is in the middle. Whatever it is I'm trying to carry is in the middle. There's an axis at one end, and at the other end is my effort. My muscles trying to move and steer it. A real-life example of this would be, technically it's the metatarsophalangeal joint, MTP, but it's the ability to do a calf raise. And why I bring this up is because a second-class lever system gives us this arrangement where the load is in the middle, gives us the best mechanical advantage. I mean, think about it. I have no problem sharing with you. I weigh about 150 pounds. Great. How many times can you do a single leg calf raise? I mean, you could probably do 20 if I just ask you right now. Do 20 calf raises. You can do it. So my body can easily lift 150 pounds 20 times. Think about doing that in a bench press where your muscles and bones are arranged differently. Can I lift 150 pounds 20 times easily in a bench press? Hell no. So part of the reason, it's not all, but part of the reason why this calf raise is so easy for us is because of the arrangement of the muscles and bones. The load of the body is in the middle. The axis is at one end and the muscle effort is at the other. Similar to a wheelbarrow in construction of the lever system. And then an example of a third-class lever, yes, tweezers are it, but an example of a third-class lever, think of any sport with a racket or an implement. There's a C in there. Any sport with like a tennis racket. So we could do a tennis swing. Easiest ways to be would be tennis swing, baseball swing, golf swing. These are all examples of third-class levers. Most synovial joints operate as third-class levers. So an easy example would be a bicep curl utilizing the elbow, if I was going to give you one example. In this case, the effort is in the middle, or the muscular force. So be able to give a real-life example. In this case, pick one, tennis swing. Be able to say what's in the middle, the effort or muscular force. And what I also want to point out is this is the most common in the body. We don't have as much overall mechanical advantage, but this arrangement gives us the best control. So it doesn't give us as much of a mechanical advantage as a second-class lever, but it gives us more control. I'm writing down the most important things. Okay, now I have some examples here, okay? So in addition to being able to identify the load, the effort, and the fulcrum, you can measure the distance from effort to fulcrum, effort arm, or distance from load to fulcrum, resistance arm. I'm not going to have you measure them, just pointing it out. Here's a third class lever, tennis swing, muscular force is in the middle. Golf swing, muscular force is in the middle. Axis is at one end. Axis is at one end. Okay? We can actually measure this. Now, I am not going to have you do a full out measurement, but I just wanted to give you some examples. You know, we also utilize lever systems in other things, like opening a paint can. This is a first class lever because the fulcrum is in the middle. Okay? All I want to point out is that we can measure it. We can measure the resistance arm and effort arm. And through that measurement, we can actually measure our mechanical advantage. I'm not going to have you measure this. I'm just pointing out. Using this to open up a paint gives you a big mechanical advantage. I'm just saying, right? Looks like my picture didn't come. We can also measure the force. I'm not going to have you do that, but we can also measure the force needed. So if this load was 80 newtons, if 80 newtons was required to pop this up, through utilizing a first class lever, I can determine how many newtons of effort I need, only 4. Isn't that cool? I'm not going to have you do that. I'm just giving you some examples, okay? Here are some more examples about the second class lever system. This gives us the best mechanical advantage. I told you that a third class lever system is most common in the body, but it gives us more control. These are all things that I reviewed. We can then, and I know I'm almost out of time, I'm almost done. These are just examples, right? But we can look at changing the length of certain lever arms. A good example of this is being choked up on the bat. So your hands are closer . Actually, it would be the other way around. Anyway, what I'm saying is by changing the distance that you have things apart, by changing the width of the effort arm, I can change the amount of mechanical advantage. If you choke up on a bat, you lose some power, but you have more control. If you have a regular grip, you lose some control, but you have more power. Okay? I am going to talk about this other ratio when we meet in person. So I will end there. We've covered the basics of the lever systems. Again, be able to think of a real life example. Teeter-totter, seesaw, first class. Wheelbarrow, second class. Golf swing, third class. And then be able to identify what's in the middle. In a teeter-totter or a seesaw, the fulcrum, axis is in the middle. In a second class lever, like a wheelbarrow, the load is in the middle. And in the third class lever system, by process of elimination, the muscular force is in the middle. You should be able to give one example of each in the body. Our example for the first class lever was the atlanto-occipital joint, how the skull meets the first vertebra. Our example of a second class lever was the joint in the foot that allows us to do a calf raise. And our example of a third class lever would be most everything that we do at synovial joints of the limbs, like a bicep curl. And lastly, which one produces the best mechanical advantage? Class 2. And which one gives us the most control and is most common? Class 3. All right, we'll pick this up in person, and then in person we will also start the muscle. All right, happy working, folks.